Hey everybody, welcome to another fun and exciting episode of The Quick Draw. We're already off to a great start, 15 minutes late, and our guest is like having just shit fall down here. I'm not going to hear the end of this from Naughty Derek. So John, how was your Independence Day?
What? It was fine. I went with my kids to see fireworks, okay? So that. And yes.
Wait, which one? What did you go to see?
What? I went to go see the fireworks with my kids. And,
fireworks. I don't know why I heard Star Wars, but
no, and I was gonna say, and to make sure the pollsters are aware, yes, I am extremely proud to be an American because apparently only 47% of Americans are. So.
Oh, that's good. I was busy getting blocked by Twitter again.
Ah, yeah, right.
Yeah, 7-day ban. I'm not too happy with that, to be perfectly honest, considering the tweet that got me put in jail was kind of bullshit. So yeah. I do want to give a very special shout out to @CatHarmony, who is in the chat today. She was very supportive, very helpful, helping us promote this show tonight. She was helpful last night, and we got like 50 followers because of her giving us some mad props. So, Kat, I want to say thank you. Thanks for all the new people that are watching this show. If you just recently followed us, hopefully you're subscribing as well to the show. And when I get out of jail, if you guys want me to follow you back, I will try. I'm really bad at following back. So do want to say that. Do want to say thank you to Kat. I did want to fill you guys in. I'm a little pissed about it. Apparently, you cannot point out that the left is inherently violent. And you can't mention Islam, even if what you're talking about is the Nation of Islam and not Islam, and say, you know, there's all these left-wing organizations that are inherently violent. You can't say that the right is just violent. It's both sides. It's actually mostly the left. Yeah. So I'll be back on Twitter either when they look at my appeal or when Thursday rolls around, whichever comes first. Knowing my luck, they'll probably grant my appeal if they granted it all. When there's like 8 hours left in the day,
and just remember,
or in the timeout,
it's not the left who are the Nazis. Just remember that they're the ones censoring speech, being violent, generally just assuming no worldview is allowed. But remember, they're not the Nazis. Keep that in mind.
Well. Yeah, the thing that pisses me off about it is not only is my tweet very innocuous, like it's not promoting violence at all, but that's what they said it was, promoting hate and violence. You've got people on Twitter, left-wingers, that are like saying it's okay to assault people if they're wearing a hat. Like, did anybody go around saying it was okay to assault people wearing pussy hats? Like, no, this is a blatant case of a double standard. I actually wrote about this on the account last week about the cruelty of the left and censorship and what it does. Like, this kind of stuff messes with you. It seems kind of stupid and petty, but censorship messes with people in a way that, to me, is not unlike. Well, it's a lot like telling gays that how they feel makes them a bad person. Like, if you were the leftists have no problem saying that it's wrong to tell, you know, a gay man or a lesbian that you can't tell them who to love. That telling them the way they feel is wrong or sinful is hurtful and damaging to their identity and to their psyche, and then turn around and say, but by the way, if you believe in limited government, if you believe that, you know, in the American Constitution or Declaration, that makes you a Nazi, that makes you a bad person. That has no lasting damage, apparently. Right. So I'm almost black-pilled. I'm almost there.
Don't do
it. Not quite there. I'm not quite there. I'm not at the Proud Boy crack some skulls yet. But the left just keeps pushing people in that direction. So
if it does,
anyway, let's talk about sex.
I gotta get knocked out. So.
Let's talk about sex. We have a very special guest today. She is a syndicated podcaster and columnist. She is also the author of the book Scarlet Versions. You can check her out at scarletversions.com. Please give me a big hand and giving a warm welcome to our guest, Rebecca Lemke. Rebecca, welcome to the program.
Hey, y'all.
And when we say big hand, we mean applause. Please.
Actually, I was saying, yeah, well, you know, clap online as best you can. Now, Rebecca, you you've written on the topic of the purity culture, and I wanted to get your thoughts on this because one of the things that I see happening in society, and this is actually, there was an interesting poll that came out, or survey that was done. Apparently millennials are having less sex than previous generations, which I thought was kind of interesting. There's some different theories about what could cause that, but it seems like society, when we talk about sex and sexual purity, there seems to be two sides that, and both of them I think are distortions, right? On the one side, you have the very secular, sex is no big deal. You need to have lots and lots of sex to be happy. And if you're not having sex, there is something wrong with you. On the other side of that is, and this is kind of what your book deals with, correct, is the very puritanical sex is dirty. You're not supposed to have sex till you're married. And if you do have sex, you're not supposed to like it. So I kind of want to get your thoughts, like where do you see today's generation, especially with regards to millennials and the whole not having sex thing? Where's that coming from?
Well, certainly some of that, at least for the communities that I grew up in that are very conservative, purity culture type communities, that comes from the fact that many of them just simply aren't having relationships. There is a lot of single 20 and 30-year-olds that I know from those communities. You either get married really, really young in those communities, or you don't hardly at all. So that would be one side of it. The other side, I don't know how red pill you want me to get here, but the other side is that men and women. Okay. Right. Men and women both don't want to get married. Women don't want to get married because they don't want to be domestic, because society has told them that if they're domestic at all, they're being oppressed by the patriarchy, yada, 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 abused because you have to do dishes sort of thing. And the other side of that is men don't want to get married because they don't want to be divorce raped. So you have both sides being. Okay,
wait. Can we back that up? Can you explain that term, divorce rate? Because I've never heard that one before.
I have a feeling I know what it's referring
to. Okay. Yeah. So divorce raped is when a man gets married and then the woman is basically indoctrinated by feminism and then decides, you know what, I'm being oppressed in this marriage. And so she divorces him, takes all of his money, and then collects child support for the rest of his life. That's divorce raped. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, I know something about that. Not the marriage part, but the whole taking of the kids, demanding, that, there's not a lot of incentive to get married for guys because basically,
it's very dangerous.
Yeah, because the guy has everything to lose, including up to and including your own children, which I do think has something to do with the amount of male suicides. Yes. I think the two aren't completely unrelated.
Yeah.
Okay, so you heard it from us first, folks. According to John, people are committing suicide because they're not getting laid. I can believe that. I can totally believe that.
You have taken my words out of context.
I promised Rebecca that I wouldn't twist her words or say any gotcha. I promised to John. So John knows what he's getting into when he's like.
Gonna go straight for the AP headline right there.
Now, you focus on your book. You focus primarily on purity culture and how that has kind of impacted. Especially conservatives and religious folks' perceptions of sexuality. Can you elaborate on that or go into that a little bit in detail?
Sure. Do you want me to kind of define purity culture and stuff like that, or just
that'd be great?
Kind of give that an overview? Okay, so
if Naughty Derek is any indication, our audience isn't too bright. So explain it for his benefit at the very least.
Okay, so I make a distinction between purity culture and the purity movement. The purity movement was actually a government-funded movement in the 90s that was originally created and funded to bring down teen pregnancy rates that were skyrocketing at the time.
This is the religious right.
Right. So this is kind of a more secular twist on it, where they're just trying to get kids to stop having kids out of wedlock. And on the other side of that, you have, and the reason why I make the distinction is because both of these things use the same type of the same type of things to get their message across. So concerts, purity rings, purity pledges, rallies, all that stuff. So like, for instance, I believe it's True Love Waits or Silver Ring Thing was one of the organizations that was Christian but accepted government funding to do this. So on the other side of it, you have purity culture that is basically going above and beyond what the original movement was intended to be by telling people, you know, not only should you not have sex before you get married, but you also should not kiss, hug, hold hands, have a private conversation, be alone together at any point. And private conversation includes phone conversations, anything like that. And also, crushes were considered an emotional STD. So you were supposed to marry your first crush. We saw arranged marriages, all that stuff. Yeah.
Oh, wow. I thought I had a bad at BYU. Like, because I went to BYU, right? Which is kind of like to Mormons what the Galapagos Islands are to turtles. People just go there to get married, to mate. So and there were it's kind of diverse because there is a bit of that in my faith, not to that extreme. I thought it was bad in Utah. I thought it was bad in Utah, but nowhere near as bad. But I do remember, like, one time there was this one girl that I thought I might be interested in dating, and you know, we were getting to know each other. And she tells me she's a VL, and I'm like, VL, what's that? And she's like, virgin lips. Now, I'm from the East Coast. I was born and raised Mormon, but I am from the East Coast. So I had, you know, a bit of a gutter understanding of what that meant. So I'm like, she can't possibly mean what I think she's meaning. So I asked her, I'm like, what's a virgin lips? And she's like, you've never heard of that? I'm like, no. She's like, 21 and never been kissed. She has some clever rhyme for it. She's like, what? Wait, what? She's like, yeah, I'm saving my first kiss for my marriage, for a kiss across the altar. I'm like, wait. So if you've never been kissed and you're 21, that makes you a virgin lips? She's like, yeah. I was like, oh, okay. She's like, you never heard of that before? I was like, well, I have. We just have a different name for it. She's like, oh, what do you call it? I'm like, a loser.
But okay. So,
needless to say, I did not get the date with her, but I mean,
go figure.
I was exposed to that, and I thought, holy cow, this is intense. You're describing something that is like a million times more intense than anything I ever dealt with in like Utah Mormon culture. Like, holy cow.
He says that. However, that's not true for me. Everything you just described is exactly what I grew up with. So, in fact, I would have to ask, are you sure you're not a member of the Unification Church? But I was going to say...
I'm very sure.
But, okay, because I am. But, okay, that was the standard for us. It was not just don't have sex. It was like, especially because we did have arranged marriages, actually. So, again, this is really funny that you mentioned all of that. I was like, this is all us. I was like, so most marriages are arranged, and for certain ones of them, the standard was that you have, again, like you said, no private conversations, no hand-holding, no kissing, no nothing. Like, there was no contact whatsoever. And it's funny because it's kind of paralyzing, because it's like some guys that in order to get through their teens and early 20s doing that, they have to develop like this strong reflex to treat all girls like radioactive material. The problem is that's very difficult to turn off later. So, like, someone get married.
This explains so much, John.
What?
So
that's not me. That's not me. Sorry, I didn't go through that. That's why I have. That's why.
So, I mean, okay, but Rebecca, what impact does this have on dating then? I can't imagine getting past the first date if my first date went like what you just described. It'd be like, bye.
There is no dating. You don't date in purity culture. Exactly. You court.
I know exactly that.
Right. So courtship is, in purity culture at least, there's different types. There's some leniency in some families. That's really rare, though, in my experience. Most families that do courtship that is very similar to dating have been from public school. But because homeschooling was what I was raised with, so that's kind of where I got all of this. Anyways, courtship is where the first date is basically a marriage proposal. So you do not.
So it is kind of like Utah Mormon culture.
In that sense.
So the first date, you have to go through several interviews with the dad. The girl doesn't necessarily know about it. And then all of a sudden, oh yeah, you're getting married to this guy. And it's not all like that. Like my husband's courtship was, he had to talk to the dad, and there was no, you can't talk to my daughter sort of thing, like that going on, where it was a little bit more lenient, where he could have potentially gone out on some dates. But as it stands, it didn't happen. So yeah, you don't date in purity culture, you court.
Wow.
Yep.
Well, okay, so now what do you mean by courting? Because when you say, to me, when I talk about courting, right, I think, so this is kind of funny. Like when I met my wife, I knew that you weren't supposed to ask her on a date. Right? Because she's from South America, their culture is very different. You kind of have to warm up to that. And if you, and all these guys are like, hey, do you want to go on a date? She was like, no, go away. I was like, hey, do you want to hang out, maybe catch some movie and get some ice cream, which is a date, but I didn't call it that.
Can't call it.
So, but because for me, a date is something like that. You go out, you have fun, right? The whole point is to get to know the person. Courting to me is, okay, we've been dating for a while, or we've gotten to know each other. We see this going somewhere seriously. I would like to date you exclusively. I would like to date you in a way that is conducive to marriage. Is that the same thing, or are we talking about something different?
No, we're talking about something different. So when it comes to that version of courtship, that's sort of an antiquated version, like what maybe my grandparents or great grandparents would think of as courting.
The Victorian era.
Basically, yeah. Sort of the so courtship, the way I'm talking about it, if you've ever read like Amish romance, it might be kind of close to that.
That sounds like a smutty romance novel right there.
They are.
Quite the title. And she churned his butter for hours and hours.
I don't read Amish romance for that very reason. It's really bad.
Many Amish romance novels are not big page turns.
And he lowered her pantaloons ever so slowly.
But here's the thing.
And made sweet love to her until the cows literally came home.
Now, if I might interject, I think, might it be safe to say that courting, because my understanding of courting is that it's not merely like dating is the idea behind dating is it's just you and that other person, whereas courting is the idea that you are keeping in mind this is a family thing. This is a coming together of families, and therefore no interaction between the two of you happens without the okay and oftentimes the supervision of the family. Not always supervision, but definitely with the blessing of it. You know.
Right.
So
and here John has opened up the opportunity to inject a keep marriage in the family joke. Thank you for that, John.
Okay. It was like, yeah, that's right. You never made me that promise. I will simply.
It's really hard to be reverent with this topic. I'm not gonna lie. It's really. What were you gonna say, Rebecca?
So one of the big differences between courtship as I know it and dating as I know it is one of the big things in the original courtship movement was dating trains you for divorce. So dating trains you to be like giving pieces of your heart away to multiple people and not marrying those people, which is where the emotional STD comes in. In the beginning of Joshua Harris's book, he has this story where this couple is at the altar and one of the partner's previous like exes each come up and he or she is like, what the heck? And they say, I'm sorry, I'm all yours now, but I've given them a piece of my heart. And so I can't give you all of mine. So that's kind of where the emotional STD comes in and all that stuff. So they tell you that dating is training for divorce.
Doesn't that kind of treat love as a zero-sum game? Like I joke around with people. I tease, I flirt, but you know, my wife and I, you know, we're okay with joking around and teasing our friends because at the end of the day, we know, like, yeah, we love each other, right? But caring about other people and having friendships where we're comfortable enough to joke around with people like that doesn't mean we love each other any less. Like, you can care. Like, I tease John all the time. Like, he's my heterosexual life partner, right? John and I will be like, yeah, I love you, man. I love you, man.
Exactly.
But It's like it's not like me caring about John and having a platonic. Derek's going to give me shit for this. Having a platonic, loving friendship with John doesn't mean I love my wife less. So I'm trying to understand it. How do you reconcile if you're a Christian, right? Because this is where this is kind of where this purity culture is predominant, right? Is in Christianity and maybe even like Orthodox Judaism, I would suspect, right? But both believe in a loving God and an all-loving God. So how do they reconcile this notion of I can't give all my heart to you because I gave a piece of it to someone else with the idea of, you know, being an all-loving, and love isn't a zero-sum game. Just because somebody loves you doesn't mean they love somebody else less.
Right. So my husband and I joke that the purity culture version of love and pieces of your heart is like Harry Potter Horcruxes.
Right.
Yeah. Basically what you have here is people just not thinking, not putting all of the pieces together of what logically follows from this doctrine. Outside of that, you also have intellectual dishonesty of, well, we have to do something with these kids, and so this is what we got to do. And beyond that, you also have cognitive dissonance where people just don't even put the two together to be able to say, oh, something's wrong here. This doesn't make sense. So that's basically how you get away with this. And like I said, dating is just giving your heart away to people. So the other big difference between dating and courting in these circles is dating is actually less serious. And so you have courtship where your first date is essentially a marriage proposal, and they think that that's going to protect you somehow from getting your heart broken, all that sort of stuff, when in reality, it makes it 0 to 60 in one date rather than actually going through the natural progression of things.
Oh, I mean, it's not, I tease Utah a lot because it's Utah. But I want to make it clear, this isn't happening to every Mormon in Utah, but it happens enough. Like my wife and I, we dated for 2 years off and on. You know, we dated for like 1.5 years. She dumped me. I like to tell myself it was. I like to tell myself it was mutual, but no, she dumped me. We got back together. She dumped me again. We got back together. And by that point, we knew it's like, okay, you know, this thing is happening. But we knew that was 2 years. That was 2 years, right? That was like 1.5 years of dating on and off, and then like 6 months of being courting and engaged, right? So we knew people, though, like by the second date, the guy had proposed. By the third date, she had a ring because she had said yes. It was, and by the second week of them knowing each other, it was like, oh, we're married. And I remember there was this one girl in my math class that I kind of had a crush on. This was before I met my wife. And I asked her on a date, and she was like, well, actually, I just met this guy and we're getting married in a couple of weeks. I was like, wait, you were single like 3 days ago. I remember because I asked if you had a boyfriend because I didn't want to walk into this minefield like where we are right now. I didn't want this. I was trying to avoid this. Thanks. So
the interesting thing is just that, and it's funny, I was going to say, for anyone who thought that was fast, I was going to say that in our church, we had people who were matched blindly. So like, including my own parents, actually, when they got married, they knew each other for a grand total of 3 days. They were put together.
I'm not saying it can't work. Like it
can, but it takes the right kind of people. Right. And the other thing I was going to say is as maybe a segue, I don't know, but I was going to say, I tended to see that if you overkill the purity culture, because I think it has its good points, but it also tends to go overkill. It drives people to do the opposite. Yes. If you push them too hard, and I know because this is somewhat what happened to me. You know, it was the idea that if you push me to think that every girl is poison, then it's just going to make them more attractive to me because I'm going to be like, okay, now I want to know more. Why are they so supposedly so poisonous? You know, and what is the big deal here? So like, I think that there's a balancing point, you know, and I think that when you don't find that balancing point, you drive people to extremes where, you know, like you have to, you know, the results of that culture today where people said, okay, sex has no consequences. It's no more important than drinking a glass of water. You just do it with as many people as you can. And that culture, I think, is starting to burn out.
You drink a lot of water with a lot of people, John?
I don't kiss and tell.
You water whore.
I do not kiss and tell.
Now, you actually kind of touch on this with your book. In your book, you talk about kind of legalism and how, and also spiritual apostasy, of how this what this purity culture does is, instead of helping people, protect them, instead of lowering teen pregnancy rates stay the same, but now people they fall away from their religion, they become less spiritual, they become more cynical, broken, damaged goods, right? Can you go into a little more detail about that?
Yeah, so that was actually the reason I wrote the book. Outside of spiritual apostasy and just sexual deviance, I had friends trying to commit suicide because the idea that your purity was your worth was so ingrained that, you know, some of my female friends would get assaulted, things like that, and that was it. It was over. Their lives were ruined. And so there were several male and female friends that tried to commit suicide multiple times throughout my childhood over this. And so kind of the straw that broke the camel's back was just several different things happening with friends all at once, where I said, okay, I got to talk about this. And so I kind of looked at all that I knew, and I noticed a pattern of this was essentially making people choose between how God had created them and who they thought God was, and so it created an identity crisis for them, and it created an identity crisis for who God was, and it basically made them choose between their sexuality and God. And when you make that choice, sexuality usually wins in one way or another, at least for a time. And so that was really the place that I came to, that I said, I can't lose anyone else over this. And these things shouldn't be in opposition to each other. So it basically created this culture where you hated yourself because of how God made you, how God made you to be able to pick out a spouse that was good for you, that was a good genetic match for children, things like that. Attraction was, completely out of the picture. They called it lust. And, I was so impacted by this, but that I completely was able to turn off physiological signs of being attracted to somebody, like blushing and things like that, where I just completely shut it off. I felt like a monster because I just couldn't feel anything anymore.
There was a Christian, there's a woman, I think it was back at like 1905 or something like that. And her advice for Christian women at the time was, let's see if I can remember it. It was in marriage, give as little as possible. And when you do, give grudgingly. Otherwise, what could have been a proper marriage will turn into an orgy of sexual lust. And so it's basically the same mindset you were talking about.
Wait. Where's the downside to this? I'm trying to... Wait. Okay. So now there's a comment in the live chat that I kind of want to address. It's from a friend of mine, Freedom Reconnection. She talks about, and she's mentioned this before, we've had this conversation, and I want to get your thoughts on it, Rebecca.
Sure.
Yeah, so her position that she mentions in the chat room is to test drive several models. So we've talked about one extreme, right, which is the purity culture. Is the solution then? Is that the solution? Is the solution to say, okay, you have got to just go full steam ahead, open the dike, and just let it go? Or are you going more for like a happy medium here? Like what would be your response to somebody who says, well, that's why you should, the situation that you described, that the misery and the suffering that you described, that's why you should, have multiple sexual partners before you settle down and get married?
So with all due respect, this is actually not something I recommend at all. And before I get into the reasons why specifically, just in my dynamic, there's actually some studies to show that outside of the physical risks, so STDs, things like that, there's also pretty significant emotional and mental health problems that come from having multiple partners as a woman. We are not designed to be able to do that. It causes higher rates of suicide, depression, anxiety, all that different stuff. So that, as far as a human, just a human reason not to do that, I absolutely always put forth that information, because as somebody who struggles mentally, I would never want a woman to unknowingly make that choice without having the facts.
That's a good point you bring up. That's a good point you bring up. Let me check right there, because that,
Sure.
when I mentioned the poll about millennials and how they're having less sex, that was actually one of the theories as to why. Is, these are kids who were raised by the boomers, right? Mm-hmm. They were raised by the sexual revolution generation, and they were, parents who believed in free love and doing all kinds of, experimentation, because that's necessary, right? That's who you are. You shouldn't deny that to yourself. And what millennials have found is like, yeah, but you're miserable and you're not happy. And when we do what you're doing, we get rejected. We get all these emotional problems, and we don't want to deal with that shit. So you combine that with, especially with the prevalence of porn, where I don't have to deal with that. I could just go into the bathroom real quick. So I think that's a good point that you bring up. And I appreciate your being respectful and commenting to that. So what then is the solution? If you can't, if Puritanism, right, is emotionally and mentally damaging, and free love and multiple partners is also, even if you're having an emotional connection, it's still emotionally damaging, correct? Like, even if you are close to that individual, it's damaging. So if those two things are emotionally damaging, what's the solution here? How do you embrace your sexuality,
right,
in a way that is positive, right, mm-hmm. and helps you be a better partner, better lover, better spouse, what have you?
Right. So what I will say is this, in terms of just approaching dating, especially if you have grown up in purity culture, or even if you haven't, I think it's really prudent to sit down once you decide that things are going somewhere and have a conversation about the way physical affection works. So generally, I dislike the analogy of a drug simply because of the negative connotations, but it is somewhat fitting in that the more physically affectionate you are, the more you want. So I think, if a couple's trying to be responsible, the best thing to do is sit down and have a conversation about that. When do we want to get married? If we're wanting to wait to have sex, how long can we prolong that? How realistic can we get with this? And also, before that, just not accelerating past what is normal and healthy. So not treating the first date like a marriage proposal, not getting too attached in the beginning, that sort of thing. And outside of that, I really think that with the two cultures being opposed to each other, one, purity culture is it has inappropriate boundaries in it. And those boundaries are inappropriate because they go too far. There's too much of them that are unnecessary. And on the other side, you have a complete and total lack of boundaries. There are no boundaries. You're not even listening to the boundaries that your own body puts out, really. So, and mentally and physically. So I think the solution is to actually listen to our bodies with the boundaries that it's given us. And for me as a Christian, the Word of God, where He essentially tells us what's healthy for us in terms of a relationship, where it's a man and a woman, monogamous. Obviously, the Old Testament has some marriages where there's a guy with multiple women and things like that. And that's a whole nother topic. But for our society as it is right now, monogamy is really healthy for all of us. So that's kind of where I come down on it all, where you just need the appropriate boundaries and neither side has them.
I like how you put that, because that kind of reminds me of how I dated in college.
Yeah.
But the funny thing is it was considered radical, like by all kinds of people. When because I used to do the boyfriend girlfriend thing like right out the bat, right? And the problem is I'd get a girlfriend, you know, we'd be close, and then we'd make out, and we'd be, oh, we're boyfriend girlfriend, we love each other, blah, blah, blah. And then like 2-3 months later, I'd get bored and I'd break up with her because I wasn't going. Because I'm like, okay, we're not getting married, we're not having sex, like because you know I was raised in a religious household. I am deeply religious. My wife and I were both virgins when we got married. And that surprises people who know me. That surprised my wife, actually. She's like, I don't believe that you're a virgin. I'm like, trust me. But I got fed up. I got fed up with that cycle. And so when I was in college, I decided I'd try something new. And so what I did is I would do this. I would be upfront about it. If there was a girl that I liked, I'd ask her out on a date, right? Date would be like going out to dinner, going for a walk, doing some kind of activity, something that where we were engaged in conversation, actually getting to know each other. I was very upfront though, like, this isn't exclusive. Like, I'm dating you, I'm going on a date with you tonight. I'm probably going to go on a date with your roommate, 3 days from now. That, by the way, that did happen. There was at one point that I was dating like 3 different girls, and they were all roommates, and they all knew. Like, they were just like, it was very awkward. And then I was actually sitting with one of them when I went up to go introduce myself to my now wife.
Oh my gosh.
I was a bit of a whore. Still kind of am.
A man who.
So, but there were rules, right? If we were just dating, right, there was no physical intimacy other than, we might hold hands during the date. We might cuddle if we're watching a movie. There might be a kiss goodnight. And again, all depending on the chemistry and how we felt about each other. But there would be no PDAs. There would be no like snuggling out in public when we're not on a date. Like there would be no marking of the territory, to put it in those terms.
Well, I think.
And hold on. Okay. So I would do that. I would usually I was dating around 3, 4, 5 girls at a time. and whenever I had to explain this to people that weren't interested in me, that were just kind of curious as how I could, they actually thought very lowly of me because they thought I was sleeping around. The Mormon version of sleeping around, which is making out. And they're like, how can you date all these girls? You're such a man whore. And I'm like, it's not like we're boning. Like, we're not doing anything inappropriate here. I'm going on a date where we're having a nice time. We're getting to know each other. And then I'm going on a date with this other chick the next day. Like, I don't see the problem here. And I would explain this to them. And here's why I did it. The reason I did it this way is because when you take out the physicality, when you take out even just the making out part, right? You don't jump into those relationships that you get stuck in for like 2-3 months, and you're just like, this is boring. I'm not marrying this person. This sucks. Get me out of here, right? And then you have the ugly breakup, and then you can't even be friends. Like most of the girls that I dated that way, I ended up being friends after we stopped dating. And once I met my wife, after like the 3rd or 4th date, she's like, if you want to keep dating me, you got to stop dating these other girls. And that's when I knew she was the one, because I was like, I have no problem with this. Like, I can dump all these girls right now. Let's do this. But I was told by members of my faith, by people my age, whoa, dude, that's radical. That's insane. You can't do that. I get told by religious folks. I tried convincing a friend of mine who's now a very devout Catholic. And she's kind of gone off to the rat trap deep end. And I told her, I was like, and she wants to find a husband and she wants to get married. And I'm like, well, this is my advice. Worked for me. It's how I met my wife. And you know how happy we are. And she's all like, yeah, no, I can't do that. And I'm like, why not? Like, it's the easiest thing in the world. Like, and it's fun because you get to meet different people and, you get to kiss a lot of boys if that's what you're into. So what's the problem here? I got to kiss a lot of girls. It was a great positive experience for me.
See, the irony for me is that one wouldn't think so, but I was the more cynical in my approach to dating. First of all, I learned very quickly, especially in high school, that girls bring trouble into your life, so I can only handle one at a time. So so dating multiples for me at least was not something I could do because I was like, I couldn't take it. I can barely take one. How am I going to take 2 or 3 or 4?
Maybe it's just because I'm Mormon and we're conditioned to deal with multiple women. I don't know.
Well, yeah, maybe I was going to say because for me, like
I got the plural marriage thing down pat. If we ever bring that shit
and
back.
I get though where you were coming from about the people who got. I won't say I never got suicidal, but I understand where they're coming from because I did have that sense where the culture in my church was one of forget losing your virginity. You didn't even have to lose your virginity to be seen kind of as damaged goods. When you're on the marriage market, if you had any relationship whatsoever, a good half that market basically was out. You weren't going to be able to do anything. So and if you had lost your virginity, you could forget it. I was just saying there's very few people that were interested at that point. And at that point, you felt like, on the one hand, if you're devout, you're like, well, I can't marry outside because we're not supposed to. On the other hand, nobody wants you. And so you're like, well, I'm stuck. But, and I think that's not a good culture to have because, and it has loosened up over the years, but I'm just saying it was for a while at the time. But I do think part of one of the boundaries that does help, I think one thing that the purity culture does have right is the idea of that courtship, but not the boundaries they set. I do think that you should go into a relationship with the thought, marriage is the goal. Don't come in and propose, but just come in and think. Don't start this if I can't see myself, at least somewhat, can't see this leading somewhere beyond just a date. And 2, let your family be in on it. I do think it helps. I think that, maybe the early part you don't need to, but I think at some point when you say, okay, I'm kind of serious about this, let your family in on it. Let them in on it and kind of tell them, look, I'm serious about this person. I really think, what do you think? I want you to meet him. I want you to talk to him. Just tell me what you think. Because and I'm good with that setup. Believe me, there were worse setups to have in my situation where your parents get okay. Story. So because there were lots of options. So there was this girl that my mom knew in my church, and my mom absolutely loved her because so her dad is a pastor in the church, and he told the story about how she got married. And so he said when she turned about 15, 16-ish, he started thinking, okay, it's about time for me to start looking, not like get her married, but it's time to start thinking about these sorts of things. So he thought, well, I have no idea what kind of guy to look for, so I'm going to ask her. And she said, Dad, I don't want to even be involved in the process. He's like, I'm going to make myself such that I can marry anybody. I trust you enough to let you choose for me. I don't even want to know anything. And my mom was like, why can't you be like that? Yeah, that ain't happening. It was like, that ain't happening. It was like, and it was just,
it's funny. It's funny you mentioned that, John, because, and I think, Rebecca, you touch on this too, that the purity culture kind of kills dating. Like, it's that was one of the things that was harped on a lot at BYU. Church leaders would come out and had, guys, you need to date. Stop hanging out. Stop being passive. Stop, guys, ask girls out. Take them to a movie. Take them to dinner. Kiss them. Like, girls, say yes. Kiss lots of boys. Come on. Like,
we need babies for the future generation, guys. Yeah.
It wasn't even that. It was just like the whole culture at BYU was just like, you're either hanging out, and it's friends, but not really. I mean, you're not more than friends, but it's clearly there's tension and interest there, but you're just chilling. You're just hanging out. Right. Or it's like, hey, I know we've only known each other for a little while. Let's get hitched. And it's like there's no in between, right? And that creates problems. Like, you have increased divorce. You have people, or even if you don't, I don't think the divorce rate is that high in my faith, but there's a lot of unhappy marriages, right? There's a lot of unhappy people in their marriage because they got married too soon, because they. This is actually something that. So I mentioned. To you, Rebecca, off camera, that there's a book that very much reminds me of your book called And They Were Not Ashamed, which is by an LDS sex therapist. And in the first chapter or two, she talks about what she calls good girl syndrome. And the reason why she calls it good girl syndrome is because women are more impacted by it than men. Because men, we're funny, Like, our brains can say, no, we're not interested, but our bodies are saying, fuck you, we're doing this. Whereas women, if a woman's brain shuts off, if a woman says, I don't want this, then her body says, cool, we're good. We're not going to do this. So women are more impacted by puritanical norms, where that treats sex as dirty, that treats sex as something to be shunned or as a disease. Right, rather than something that's a part of you, is something that God has given, that our Creator has given us, not just for procreation, I think, but also to enjoy, to bond with that special someone. And so she calls it good girl syndrome because good girls don't do it, and when they do it, they don't like it. And so there's a lot of the fact that there's a book dedicated to, now there's 2 books dedicated to dealing with this problem. I think that this is something I'm very passionate about, because I've seen it with my own parents. I've seen it with friends and people that I went to school with that are just, I see it with friends online and who are not happy in their marriages because they're missing something. They don't have that fulfillment and they're miserable. And yeah, I definitely think this is something that should be addressed. I'm really glad you came on the show today. Thank you for having this conversation with us. We're definitely gonna have you back on, because there's a lot more that you have talked about on your podcast and in your book and in your columns that we would love to discuss. So make sure, guys, if you aren't following Rebecca, that you are now. It's at Do Crunchy Mom. I read that and I thought it was like going to be like a hippie thing.
I was kind of a hippie mom when my son was younger, and now I'm like more not hippie. Still have hippie tendencies, but not crunchy hippie.
You put the Birkenstocks away after these born.
I don't need these. I don't even get these.
Make sure, guys, that you check out her book. It is on Amazon.com. It is Silent Virgins, correct?
The Scarlet Virgins.
Scarlet Virgins. I'm sorry, the Scarlet Virgins. Her website is scarletvirgins.com. We've been talking for the last week. It's been a real pleasure to get to know her. She's very smart, very educated. I actually learned a new Greek term. It's a concept. It's a concept I've always believed in, right? It's a concept that my church teaches. We just never had the cool Greek word for it. The idea of, there are things that God commands, right? If you read this, if you believe in God, if you believe in religion, there are things that God commands. Thou shalt not. Thou shalt. Right? But then there are other things where the Bible and the scriptures are silent. So you got to use your agency. You got to figure it out. And I'm really glad you're tackling this purity culture thing, because the thing that stands out to me the most, and the thing I think that as a conservative, as somebody who believes that people should be able to govern themselves, and so the thing about purity culture that kind of offends those sensibilities is it deprives people, especially women, of their agency. It takes away that agency. It disenfranchises them and takes away their power. So I applaud you for standing up and being a voice for women who, are exploring their sexuality and trying to kind of come to terms with it and find that balance. So thanks again for coming on the show. Guys, make sure you're following her. Make sure, if you are new to the program, this is first time seeing it, make sure you hit subscribe. Make sure you're also following us at ornery_opinions. Also, make sure you're following John. John finally changed his ad. Everybody give him a big round of applause. Yay! It only took about a month and a half of me badgering him. So, John, what's your new ad again? I know it has something to do with Phoenix.
It is now at Firelight Phoenix. I could not spell it Phoenix. That's how I wanted to, but apparently it was too long. So it's Firelight. Thank you.
That's what I'm here for.
Firelight Phoenix. Phoenix spelled Phoenix. So yes, at Firelight Phoenix.
All right. So make sure you're following John, especially since now he's going to be my mouthpiece, since I can't curate the ordinary opinion because leftists are retards. Twitter is retarded. Yeah. So anyway, we will see you guys next week. Thanks again for participating in chat. We had some good comments, good discussion, lots of innuendo. I knew you guys wouldn't let me down. So we will see you guys next week. You have a great weekend and have a great week. Take care.